So, like I said before, what we usually do in these afternoon sessions with the Observatory and Forum is that we take a bunch of assumptions, a bunch of context, we explain them to you, and then we have discussions between each other. So what we are going to do today, and our role with my colleagues here, is only to drive the discussions, facilitate the discussions, but what we actually want is to have interactions between all of you. So we are going to share the mic between all of you and drive the discussion on specific questions. And what we would like to cover today are aspects related to the main hurdles that are facing projects today. So we discussed a bit this morning about use cases, we discussed about projects, and what we want to tackle now is what are the main hurdles that these projects are facing, what are the existing solutions, and how we can share best practices between each other. And then of course we will have more parts on the perspective, what is going to happen, and what recommendations can we formulate between each other to the European institutions, but also to the industry actors. And so this will be split into four main different phases. First, we are going to talk about the technical hurdles. This is the first thing we are going to do. For each step, we are going to spend around 20 to 30 minutes on each discussion, depending on the interest from the audience. So please bear with us and be as active as possible. Technical hurdles, of course, we are going to talk about privacy, scalability, standardization. These are aspects that you might have already discussed with us in previous workshops. We did one in Berlin on the topic of scalability and interoperability. Then we are going to move on one of the main topics that was highlighted during the morning session, which is how do you bridge the data that is in the real world events with the data that is on-chain, and what are the technical challenges that you have there, what are existing solutions to that problem, and how, for example, IoT can be part of the solution. Two last elements will be on organizational and governance challenges. I don't recall who said that this morning, but I found it interesting. Don't worry about IT, this is all fine, but worry about who you are going to work with. I apologize, I can't remember who exactly said that. If you can raise your hand. Arnaud said that, maybe? No? Yeah? Arnaud. So thank you for the quote, Arnaud. And finally, we are going to focus more on the future of supply chain solutions. What can we foresee? What kind of integration with enforcement bodies can we see? So of course, it was interesting to have this first conversation about what is doing EU IPO, and we'll be able to leverage that and go beyond during the afternoon discussions. Finally, on this aspect for future supply chain solutions, we are going to talk about how we can impulse European projects and see what are the best means in order to create European champions that are able to really foster the benefits of the technology and make it available to everyone in the EU. So without further ado, let's start the conversation with something that I hope won't drive too much on the discussion about GDPR, but really more on the topic of privacy and confidentiality. So what we want to discuss today is one issue that we hear a lot often. It is about what are you going to do with these open platforms and all the data that is in there. And the reason you are asking this question is because, of course, there is a lot of interactions and there is a lot of valuable data that is put inside these blockchains. And on the other side, when you are a company, you want, of course, to keep your privacy, you want to keep your terms and your contracts private, and you want to keep basically your business out of the view of your competitors. And so this is the first question that we are going to tackle. For that, very simple illustration. The idea here is to illustrate how a phishing process is getting data from the real world to the blockchain. And here what we want to highlight are the actual data that is coming inside the blockchain. Because first, when people are saying, oh, there are many valuable secrets, we first have to look at what is actually inside the chain. And so for each process, as you can see here, we have timestamps at each step of the process, from the fish being fished to the fish being sold, after being processed, after being shipped, and after being stored. And so what you can see here is that most data are not directly data that could be used and that could be useful, for example, for competitors. Timestamping, tags, geolocalization details, shipping conditions, for example, temperature, when you are shipping the fish and you want to make sure that the frost chain was not broken. But what we can see here is that even if individually this data wouldn't mean much, it is very likely that in aggregate this could tell a lot about a business. If we aggregate volumes, if we identify who are the suppliers and who are the clients of a specific company. And so the first question that I would like to ask to you today is, what do you think about this model? What are the main issues that you can see, and what are maybe data that is not in there and that you think could be causing any trouble to businesses? And then we are going to move on to solutions, technical solutions, in order to cope with these privacy issues. So again, the goal is to have an open conversation, so thank you very much, Manuel, for opening the floor. Maybe Ken, you want to say a word before that?
I wanted to answer your question. If I'm allowed.
Go ahead, and Manuel will be second.
So, in projects that I've been involved in, there are clearly two extreme approaches and then a range of grays in between. And so I'll just describe what I've seen so far. So at one extreme, there are some architectures that use the blockchain as the repository of data. So typically, those are enterprise projects, and so typically they are done on a permission blockchain. But among the people who have access to that permission blockchain, there is usually a smart contract that will store all this information for every piece of merchandise, and that will be readable by everyone on the blockchain. And so that's a very simple architecture that has the advantage of transparency, but has no privacy. And then at the other extreme, there are some architectures that I've been involved in where absolutely no data at all is stored on the blockchain. And so in those situations, the way the solution is architected is that each actor has their own database, exactly the same as today. And the only goal of the blockchain is to allow those actors to prove that their data is authentic in case there is later on a disagreement regarding the shipment or delivery of a piece of merchandise. And so technically this is called Merkle tree, and there is this concept of Merkle tree and Merkle proof, meaning that every actor regularly posts a Merkle root on the blockchain, allowing them to produce a Merkle proof later on if anyone contests the authenticity of their data. And then in between you have all kinds of solutions where the data is not completely accessible, but it's still stored in the blockchain in private form or in hashed form or using private channels like in a Hyperledger Fabric architecture. And so, but I'm seeing those range of solutions. And what's very interesting, I think, is that if the privacy constraints are very complicated to manage and the scalability constraints are very complicated to manage, the Merkle tree solution is always doable. Right? So it always works. It works with as much data as we want, and it's completely private. So that's a default option that you can always fall back into if everything else fails.
Is the Merkle tree thing the same with zero knowledge proof?
No, so no.
Or one of these zero knowledge proof?
So those are all cryptographic techniques, but no, they are of a distinct nature and they have a different purpose. Would you like me to explain now, or so? Merkle proof. So with the Merkle proof, I'm going to come to you with data. I'm going to show you that data. And I'm going to show you a point in the blockchain that demonstrates that the data that I'm showing to you was in fact archived in the past as part of this piece of data. A zero knowledge proof is a different technique. A zero knowledge proof is a technique whereby I'm going to show you two pieces of data that are encrypted, and the Merkle proof, the zero knowledge proof is going to prove to you that one of those numbers encrypted is higher than the other, without you knowing what are those numbers. So an encrypted 1 is smaller than an encrypted 2. You know that that's true, even though you don't know that the numbers that I have in my mind are 1 and 2.
Hello, good afternoon. It's Manuel Machado. I'm part of Worldline, which is a French multinational that's working on payments and digital transformation. So we develop a solution such as this together with Bureau Veritas, which is called Origin. And there what we try to do is two things, is to facilitate the digitization of the whole supply chain. So we try to do a platform that is not very inclusive at the beginning, so that facilitates the participation of all the different stakeholders throughout the supply chain. And then of course we need to manage the confidentiality so that everybody is willing to participate. So the way we do it is that we manage 3 levels of information. We have public information. There is the one that impacts nobody, that is good for everybody to share. It's basically the information that we use so that the end consumer at the end of the supply chain can review everything that happened to that product. It's a summary of what happened to that product. Then we have confidential information, so it's information that is shared between 2 parties when they change products. It could impact their confidentiality against competitors or industry researchers, for example. And then we have also private information that belongs to a specific author or partner or participant in the blockchain, where they want to increase the amount of information that they are storing against the blockchain. We store none of the practical information on the blockchain, just references or pointers, but that is referenced against that blockchain. All that information, potentially you can share it with third parties. Even if it's private, you can open that to a partner for a specific topic to share it, so that you can verify something in particular, or you want to advance the cooperation on a specific point. And only for the future, I think that it would be interesting to also for consortiums to work in advance to identify the kind of information that's going to be helpful for the whole market. Because as we know, here we are digitalizing whole sectors in a way that we couldn't do it before. So it's going to be a lot of information that's going to be helpful to everybody for us to understand and to know. So I foresee that consortiums will work on some compromise with participants so that they share some part of the information that is not public, maybe anonymized, so that they can bring out some information out of the sector, how it is going on, what is the real-time pulse of the situation throughout the supply chain.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Manuel. So basically, you have an approach with 3 different layers. Are there other examples here in the room of approaches to privacy? Yes, please.
So from the Bitcoin perspective,
Yeah, just a second. Thanks.
So from the Bitcoin perspective, which is one of very large really distributed ledger out there, the only thing you need to store is the hash of your information. So the default, which the panelist mentioned before, it's basically the only thing needed. All the other information are probably already in some ERPs, So if you ever worked with a SAP HANA or you know, any other sort of ERP, basically they already have those information. Why sharing them inside a smart contract is quite a mystery. It's a it's marketable, so I understand that part. But really, at the end of the day, you need on the immutable layer, which is the blockchain, you need to store the proof that you had that data at that time. And in case of litigation, you will resort to that proof. So that's the only thing which actually really makes sense inside a blockchain. Then you have all sorts of ERP or corporate level software application layer, which of course they can have all those information, but the point of a blockchain is to prove immutability and prove security. All the rest is, yeah, it's a nice marketing move, but yeah, that's it.
Okay, so
Enterprise resource, SAP. So, excuse me, there's one?
I have more a general question to this. I've been thinking a lot about this approach of anchoring hashes into a blockchain, and one question that keeps on popping up for me is blockchain should not only be a security layer, but in some use cases also a single source of truth that everybody agrees upon. And one big problem that we have in not only in supply chain use cases, but general in enterprise use cases is duplication of data at multiple databases, and this information is then not consistent because people make mistakes and they enter wrong data. So if we use this approach of storing hashes in a blockchain, and each participant in this blockchain consortium has their own database with their own version of the truth that is anchored in the blockchain, how do you avoid that these single databases that all players maintain are fall out of sync? Because then, yeah, you can have a hash, but then if someone modifies information in the database, you will detect, yes, it's not integer anymore if you calculate the hash, but then you don't really know what the current version of the truth really is. You know that it's not correct, but you don't know what it is, so you still have a problem.
Yeah, of course. So that is exactly why there is a need for open source protocols which are shared across organization and across technology. That is exactly the use case why you need an open source protocol. So a single point of truth for complex data, it's extremely expensive. Google has it, but there are very few, Tencent maybe has it, but very few corporations can actually handle that for everyone. So, like, it's not really interesting to go up and compete in the ERP or you know, or corporate management software. It's very difficult to go and compete there. I really like that there are a lot of startups trying to create their own supply chain solution, but sooner or later they will arrive to a step where there is already a project, maybe because IBM already planted their Hyperledger, maybe because they already have SAP, or for whatever other reason, and they will never enter there. So where there is a space to work also from the policy point of view and from the technical point of view is in this transparency and immutability layer. All the rest has already been done many years. I mean, there are huge companies, Salesforce, SAP as just examples. So all the rest has already been done. So yes, you need of course a protocol. Yeah.
So I'll just answer that quickly. So I think there are two comments here. I think one is, so I absolutely agree that what you're describing is something that works right now in the current state of the technology. But it's also, we need to recognize that it's hard to predict where the technology will go, and we don't want to find ourselves in a situation where we would say, oh, you can't watch movies on the internet because the internet is too slow. So I think some things will be available in the future. We don't know what those are. The second point I'd like to make is that I think that as you know, the blockchain is not simply an immutability layer. It is also, at least some of us believe, the internet of value. And so I think that in a world where you are using the blockchain not just to have objects and merchandise signal their state and position, but also in a situation where you're using those state changes to trigger payments between actors in the ecosystem, then having that layer that is essentially a registry of balances, so a decentralized bank that holds account balances for all those payments coming in and out of steps on the value chain, I think that has value, and that could be a second benefit to using the blockchain to store some limited data, and only the data that is necessary to trigger those payments.
Manuel, you
Maybe
want to say
a
something?
couple more comments before we move on, but yeah, Manuel, please.
Yeah, I agree with Ken, what you said. Is I don't think the blockchain is just immutability. It's a leverage for us to change the way we exchange information and do business with other companies or other participants. And that's it. I had another point, but I forgot it. Sorry.
Yeah, just one remark. I think, and it has been mentioned earlier as well, blockchain has a lot of different meanings, and you can define it very strictly or broader. And we're doing blockchain projects in ports, for instance in the port of Antwerp, and there we were quite pragmatic. So we use blockchain technology, but we combine it with other technologies, like for instance IPFS, in order to have decentral storage of information. Because one of the limitations of blockchain is, first of all, is scalability. As you replicate all the data on all your nodes, if you want to exchange millions of documents, it does not make sense to have copies of those documents on every node of your network. So I think as the technology is right now, deploying blockchain pur sang is not very realistic or not very scalable, and you have to complement it with other things. And we do it with decentral storage. We are a believer of smart contracts. A little bit, if I understand your reasoning, you're not very fond of that opportunity for sharing business logic, where you are able to automate certain business processes, and where you have a shared view on that logic. I have a different opinion on that. I believe in smart contracts, but due to privacy, we put in the smart contracts only very essential information that is required for that business process. And if you, for instance, would see this example, there's a lot of data, details on location, factory, etc., which we would not put on the blockchain, but only on the blockchain in the smart contract, very basic information that is required for the business logic.
Maybe just
our
last point here, because
Yes, for quite some time.
Thank you. In my opinion, also it's important to understand the customer point of view. So if you just have an hash, a customer at the end of the day doesn't understand it, and even if he has a hub that can trace it, everything, it doesn't have the storytelling that it needs for the customer. So adding more information, a little bit more information for myself is important, also to add customer value to the solution.
Okay, so I think it's a good time to move on to solutions, because what I hear from you is that from one side we want to have strong privacy, and this sometimes means to use blockchain only as a notarization tool, only keeping hashes of data on chain, but also there is disadvantages of using the on-chain capabilities of the technology, which could be used, for example, to trigger payments. And so there might be some solutions in order to keep both of the best worlds, having private data that remains private, but still being able to use it. And so we are going to move on to some solutions, and let's challenge them. So basically, when we talk about privacy, there are three main layers on which you are going to work. First one is access, who has permission to read and or write on the chain, and who has access to the data that is there. Second, you have the visibility, to whom transactions are broadcasted, and what is the level of encryptions or the techniques that are used to obfuscate the data that is on-shared. And finally, you have the storage. How is data stored? Is everyone able to store the data? Is this data encrypted or not? And what are you going to do with this data? And what you're actually going to protect are three elements. First is privacy of participants. When we are talking about participants here, we are including all the different actors, from consumers to suppliers to all the merchants in the chain. And you want them to remain anonymous to each other unless there are bilateral interactions. And so the tools that you can use in that context are elements like ring signatures, where you are going to mix, to have the addresses of multiple actors brought together in order to mask who is originating, from where the original signature is originating. Stealth addresses, mixing, storage of private data of chain. Of course, this element of storing private data of chain is referring to the storage layer here. But these are the elements that you want to use in order to keep the privacy of participants. Then you have the privacy of data, when you try to hide what is the content of the transactions, what are the balances of the different contracts, what are the amounts for each transactions. And here maybe, coming back to what was said before, is where we can most leverage the cryptographic tools, where you have data that remains private but that is still usable. And these tools are, we talked about it before, zero knowledge proofs, IKSNARKs, Pedersen commitments, where you are going to, just briefly, Pedersen commitments, you are going to commit on a specific number, and this number you will be able to prove later on that this is the one you have chosen before the transaction. But mainly zero knowledge proofs, keeping data private. And so my question here would be, do you think that this could be a solution in order to bring the transparency level? And actually what we want in this transparency level is the ability to trigger transactions and to trigger payments, for example, on-chain, while still keeping data private. So I'm going to stop there and keep the privacy of terms for later, which is a bit simpler. So question is open here. What do you think about this type of solutions? Do you know about other solutions that could be used? And do you think that this could be the missing link between transparency and privacy?
Maybe just to throw in an alternative as well. I don't know the exact technical details of it, but Parity in Berlin has developed a concept called, they call private contracts. They've developed it for the Energy Web Foundation because they had the problem that some utilities do transactions and not all the utilities are supposed to be aware of the content of these transactions. And the way it works is it's essentially a smart contract. In very simple terms, I think it's a smart contract that is encrypted and stored on-chain, but then there is a separate environment where only selected participants can decrypt information in this smart contract and use it for the transaction that they're doing. And I think it's open source and it's usable. But yeah, I don't know all the exact details of how it works.
That's an example, yeah.
Yeah, also Quorum has a system like private contracts that is, I think, more or less the same, at least at a high level. Another thing that I read of that it seems interesting in the privacy of data, it's a project called Enigma from MIT that uses multi-party computation that I think it's more or less a mix of other techniques, but it's interesting for the privacy of data.
Can you maybe just explain what multi-party computation is for the people in the room that might not be aware of that?
In very simple terms, and as I understood it, it's the possibility to have calculations on encrypted data.
Yeah. So I also wanted to mention the parity project, which is very relevant. And in a way, if you think about a smart contract, actually you don't need to see my business process. You just need to see the proof that I did the business process correctly. So that's the, if I have, I mean, this is not investment advice, but I think that is a very promising field. So you don't need to show your, in clear your business logics. You just show that you execute whatever operation you were supposed to do correctly, and the outcome is the correct one, which is basically that. Yeah.
So what I hear is that there are multiple technologies here that are being used. Do you know any that are currently being leveraged in large-scale production projects? Do you have examples of it?
So I think it's important to first realize that so here there are a lot of words that most people don't understand, and so very, to simplify things, encryption is not hard. We use it for credit cards every day on the internet, or even to visit websites. What is hard is encryption that does not rely on a single authority. So when I connect on a website, my browser requests a certificate from the publisher of the website and verifies that this certificate has been signed by a central registry, usually VeriSign. And so that's very easy. But the problem with that is that it requires some degree of centralization of authority that says, what I can rely on. And so in the case of the parity solution, that's exactly, it's a relatively centralized solution as well, in the sense that every piece of data is encrypted, and you just need to ask 3 separate nodes to give you 2 or 3 pieces of decryption passwords, and with those decryption passwords you can read the data. And so I think, so yes, to answer the question, yes, so Hyperledger Fabric, which has encrypted channels between parties, is used in large-scale projects, such as the Food Trust network, that's the proper name, right? As well as TradeLens, and similarly in the Congo project that we talked about earlier, this project is live, relies on quorum, and involves privacy as well. And those are fairly simple situations where, given the high degree of centralization, it's easy to process encrypted data at fast rates. As we progress in the development of the technology, we'll see more of those techniques on this page being used that allow us to achieve the same result, but with less reliance on single authorities.
Any comment on that aspect before we move on to the next big topic, scalability? Okay, well, thank you very much for your participation on this. Let's move on directly to the second topic, Claire.
Yes. So our second technical hurdle that we can find in blockchain is scalability. Every time we talk about blockchain, the scalability issue came back. In the supply chain, the purpose is to gather more actors and to handle a large number of transactions. Before, these transactions were most of the time bilateral between one producer and one transporter and one seller. Now they are going to be all together on the same system. And we could think that it could create a scalability issue with the time. But also, as I think Kent told us this morning, I'm not aware of any project who have been stopped because of a scalability problem, or any supply chain problem who would have been stopped because of this problem. So even if it's not a problem yet, we can think that in sometimes large supply chain consortium or blockchain-based supply chain will need a certain amount of scalability. The problem is it's difficult to evaluate because we always compare with PayPal or Visa, but actually we don't have any reference in terms of supply chain needed, how many transactions per second a blockchain-based supply chain should handle, and it's why we would like to know if you have any idea of the amount of scalability that will be needed for a supply chain-based blockchain.
So I just share like personal experience from past projects. I can't tell you like this is how much scalability you need, but what I personally experienced a couple of times is I usually put use cases in three categories. The first one is it's just low number of transactions per second, so transactions are distributed throughout the day. The second category is it's peaks, so you have all of a sudden thousands of transactions that come in, but then after that it slows down again. And the third one is you have tons of transactions that come in, and it's critical that this data is available immediately the second after. And what I've experienced is that the third case is almost never true for blockchain use cases. I haven't seen a lot of blockchain use cases also in supply chains where you had a real-time requirement. So that someone entered the data, thousands of shipments, and then a millisecond after, someone else had to act upon this data right after. And the case was usually always the situation that you had peaks, but then maybe the next party that needs this data needs it an hour later or 2 hours later. So it was actually okay to have a lower transaction per second and just process these transactions on the go, because the next party that needs the validated information only needed it one or 2 hours after that. So I haven't experienced, and like we had a lot of enterprise customers coming and saying, how many thousands of transactions can you do per second? And then when we asked, well, how many transactions per second do you need? The answer was, well, I don't know. Right? And so I think when we started challenging the companies there, most of them realized, okay, maybe actually we don't need such a high number of transactions per second.
And do you think it depends of maybe the industry or the use case? Like for a food supply chain blockchain, the amount will be a low amount with some high moment, but in general a low amount. When actually I think someone talk about kind of a traceability of financial transaction, where maybe largest amount could be needed, and it will depend of each industry and each use case.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an industry-related problem.
Yeah, I think I agree with the gentleman. The scalability limitations are not in terms of transactions per second, but we see it more in data volume. So we're, for the moment, literally, I think one of the slides showed it earlier, every international shipment has 28 documents of multiple pages. Every day there are millions of shipments. So the data volume, that is, I believe, where the scalability limitations will come up. And I believe that pure blockchain is not able to deal with those large volumes of data. Maybe the gentleman who has a lot of experience with IoT has also an opinion on this. I think if you connect to your blockchain millions of sensors who constantly produce measurements of temperature or of pressure, also you immediately, you cannot replicate that data on every node.
Yeah, that's a very valid comment. So on our side, we're asking the question is how much data do you need to keep on chain? So as I mentioned during my presentation, we have a layer 2 scalability, which means that it's a scalability on top of the blockchain, where in an ideal environment, you're trying to assure the same level of security as you have on the core chain, because you could scale either by adding side chains, as somebody's already mentioned, or by having, I mean, at Ambrosus, we've created a notion of a bundle. Just as the name suggests, we bundle smaller transactions together. In our case, it's 16,000 of these transactions. And on the core chain, it takes place as a one transaction but then there's like a mini database that's actually posted on layer 2. And what this allows you to have is you can simply have an Amazon server or just Google or any standard cloud architecture where the actual bundles are stored and the hashes of those are on the core chain or the metadata. And this solves actually two problems at the same time. This solves the scalability problem, but also in the previous discussion of privacy, actually also companies are not afraid that their personal data will be visible because metadata doesn't give you indication of what's actually the real data. So from that perspective, yeah, that's a simple question of do you actually need to record that data? And the second question that we're approaching, and we've solved it through cryptoeconomics, is how long do you need to keep this data? Because at some point, you know, on blockchain is just as the name suggests, you have new blocks being formed on top of each other. So how deep should this history go? And if we're talking about tracking the temperature of a steak, imagine some guy ate a steak in '97. Do you care about the temperature at which it was transported at that year? No. So what do we do with all this data that will be stored there, and how do we, you know, get rid of it without breaking the basic notion of blockchain that you can't delete the data? And this is where kind of time-limited storage or any other concepts can be very interesting, and that's exactly what we're working on. But I agree that so far we haven't had a case where, you know, the scalability was a major issue in the supply chains, because yeah, if you don't take a pure on-chain scalability, there are many solutions already to work around it. It's more a matter of, you know, getting the corporations and the stakeholders to adopt the technology, and for the technology to just integrate well with other solutions.
So what I understand is actually scalability. There is many technical solutions were developed right now, side chains and probably other one, and the research is continuing, and it will not be the main problem. But just for coming back on what you say about side chains, do you have any other example of good, or maybe not keeping the data too long? Do we need very old data? Do there is any good technological choice that we should make, good practice in terms of technology for improving the scalability? Yep. Oh, you can answer to the question before.
No, I just wanted to sorry, I didn't mean to interject that way, but I just wanted to react to the conversation so far. You know, obviously these slides is very limiting in the way it's trying to portray things, because, as it was said, a lot of these things are going to be application specific, right? And it's not, when you talk performance, it's not just transactions per second, it's also latency, whether you have finality or not. All these questions come into play, and they will matter more or less depending on the application. Not to brag about it, but you know, Hyperledger Fabric was designed so you have a lot of flexibility in that way, so that based on your application, you'll be able to tune it based on your needs. Because, you know, as I was talking earlier about these research people who came and said, hey, we have made these improvements that, you know, increase the number of transactions to 20,000 transactions per second or so. And, you know, it does add some centralization, which for some people is not worth it. And others say, hey, for that much improvement, I'm willing to trade in a little bit more centralization. And those things are not black and white, and there's no absolute answer that will work for everybody. So it's really going to be on a case-by-case basis that these things need to be looked at.
Yes, I do agree on what you just said. And regarding what has been said this afternoon, I think there are two standard way of using blockchain technologies for supply chain use case. The first one, and we spend a lot of time describing it, it's the notarization solution. So basically, you use digital fingerprints or Merkle rules, and you notarize them in the blockchain, and just you have the possibility to manage the volume of data easily. So you can define, you put one digital fingerprint per minute, or one per hour, or one per day, depending on your business case. And the second solution, we didn't talk much about it, but some of you mentioned it earlier, is coding business rule directly in the smart contract. So smart contract in the blockchain, in the supply chain use case, can be seen as state machine. So basically you have rules, you have states for supply chain workflow, and in the smart contract you code the business rules. So basically you enable specific rules or actor to realize a specific transaction. And the choice between these two standard solutions should be driven by the business use case. So if you handle high volume of data and you are not able to manage non-fungible products, maybe you will prefer a notarization solution. But if you manage a very low volume of product, but high financial value product, maybe you will prefer to manage them individually with a non-fungible token solutions, and you will secure the supply chain business rules directly in the smart contract. So the starting point is always the business case, and the technological solution or the technological architecture should be taken according to this business case.
Okay, so I think if I can summarize what I've been said, it's mainly an industry case-by-case issue, and it's not really an issue since there is many technical solutions to solve it. If there is no, if everybody agree with the solution, we can.
Yes. Yes, but even there are design workarounds right now, but we should aim to improve the technology. And the way to improve the technology is, again, for government agencies, enterprises to request solutions so that there are people who are incentivized to building those and improving those technologies. So I think Europe has a great role to play in terms of creating demand for those people who will contribute to improving the technology.
So if the adoption is larger, we will have more people working on R&D and develop new solutions.
Whereas if we continue to have all kinds of banks doing proof of concepts at very small scale, then everyone is just going to produce technology that delivers proof of concepts at very small scale.
So we need to have a project with large scale.
Until China delivers the technology that can handle billions of transactions per second.
Okay. Last comment, and after we'll talk about standards.
Well, it's a good segue for me. Both the, what do we call, for instance, the smart contracts, that's one thing about storing them, but smart contracts reacts and uses data that very often is coming from very large centralized systems and aggregations, and we must also realize that the blockchain is a severely bad database when it comes to aggregations, when it comes to analytical capabilities and such. So my issue here is that maybe one should concentrate more on creating a functional API and standardization layer between blockchain implementations and external systems built on regular databases, and concentrate on creating a standardized interface for that, instead of trying to cram everything into a blockchain.
Can you, are there people working on that at the moment? Do you know any answers to that element that should be researched as a priority?
Could do it.
Chiara, you are free next day, so she should be good for it.
Yeah, there are solutions like this.
So maybe we can move to next slide and have Arnaud.
I wanted to quickly answer your
Yeah,
question.
sure.
Are there projects like this? I just heard, I don't know any of the details because I learned about it earlier this morning on my way here. But there is actually a Rabobank was not satisfied with the fact that they would have to choose one of the technologies to do blockchain projects. So they ended up developing their own layer, which they say is technology agnostic. I don't know any of the details. typically the challenge of this is you reduce to the common denominator, but so there are definitely people looking into these aspects for sure.
So, we.
Maybe Claire, you want to give some context about standardization and why we are talking about that. So I know the discussion is already ongoing, but maybe just to put everything into context.
So yeah, so it's another problem that came during the discussion of this morning. As we know, supply chains want to gather a large range of actors, but each of these actors has his own legacy system, his own cloud-based solution, his own way to organize his data. And what we want when we gather them in the same system is they need to be all able to enter the data in the blockchain, and they need to be all able to redraw some data and use them with their own system. So for that, we think that maybe we need some technical standards. And the first question came is, there is already some technical standard in the supply chain industry, and in this case, who provides them? And if there is not, should we create do we need specific one for blockchain? Should we make an effort for blockchain-based supply chain? And who should impulse this creation of standards? Should it be an industry corporation, industry consortium, or a governmental entity, or another public entity? So we would like to know if you have some input on this question.
Do you want to talk about that?
Me?
Yeah. You mentioned GS1 this morning.
Okay.
Exactly.
I'll turn this on here. Okay. Well, I work with GS1. I'm not a representative of GS1. And I also work with EECC, the organization behind the EPCIS standard for registering events along a production chain for a product. That is, for instance, F-Trace is a part of the examples of that when it comes to meat industries in Germany and others. I strongly recommend that one actually make contact with these people and to see if one could get some kind of an interaction when it comes to the definition of a standard of an API layer between their solution that other blockchain solutions can interact with. There are certain, and they are also part of, they are also co-owners of a organization called One World Sync that has about 20,000 of the largest industries in their network and working with. Amongst them, I think, well, they were talking about Alibaba here a while ago as well. And GS1 has about 1.2 million companies in their at the customer stock. And this means that if you are going to create a solution that in some way is interacting with blockchain, by adapting their system so they can interact with the GS1 system, then you might be getting exposure that is significantly larger than if you would do it yourself.
And do you know if GS1 is already working on some kind of specific standard for blockchain-based supply chain? Is they already interested in blockchain and already work on this topic?
If I knew, I wouldn't tell you because I would be dead. Okay. No, but it's. I'm just joking. Okay, but I strongly recommend that you do that because the issue here is you can create the most nifty blockchain solution for supply chains, and then you are going to introduce it on the global market, and you will run out of funds. And the second thing is that GS1 is a vendor neutral system. They have representative offices all over the world, and they are neutral. They are not dependent upon a singular kind of a vendor of these systems. They are neutral. That means that people trust them with their data. So that is what I recommend that we would do.
Just to react to what Eric just said about GS1, they actually are very interested into blockchain, and we do have a workshop at Carrefour to adapt the blockchain deployment solutions for filière qualité Carrefour onto the EPCIS standards. So it's something they are doing actually.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi. Working for the Commission as part of the DGIT. We are the EU Blockchain Competence Center. What we do really is we're totally agnostic of technology, so we started analyzing about 20 different blockchains on the market, etc. And we made selections, and we always try to think what could be the best asset which the Commission has, apart from its resources. And that would be documents that we need to handle on a daily basis. Different workflows, some complex ones, some small ones. And this led us also to think about architecture, and that would lead to the standards in a minute. Because in terms of architecture right now, you have different blockchains. There's not only one blockchain, right? There's loads of different blockchains. And if you think about the topic which was addressed just before in terms of scalability, in terms of data storage, which was more scalability with regards to data storage, it's interesting, and we saw that the best thing is you have your metadata, which can be on-chain, and you can have documents, can be bulky documents, can be different types of documents, different formats, which can be also on an interlinked blockchain. And this is possible as of today. This is something we're currently developing for the sake of the Commission. We're working on something called EFTG, which is the European Financial Transparency Gateway, which is a pilot. But that led us really to see what kind of architecture we can think of that can be applicable theoretically to many other use cases. So this is something which is first of all it's open source, so everyone could actually reuse it. We took a public blockchain and we put it into more like a mini private network for the time being, right? But this is something which will be reusable. So this is something very interesting for the Commission, and I think for many people today across the room, this is something we all want, is to think what can be reused. Is there something which we can reuse, something which will come at ideally low cost, for implementation, but also which will actually suit the best of needs for different applications. And to come back to the architecture and standards, it's important to stress that there are currently many efforts being done towards standardization. There is a group called TC307. It's an ISO technical committee group, which I'm a member of also from the Luxembourg side. And there was a document which actually the deadline for submitting our votes was actually on the 14th of Feb, so just last week. Personally, we decided to reject it because it was about architecture. So we're talking about architecture and standards, and I think now we're actually shaping how blockchain could actually evolve in the future. But I think we must really pay attention to the importance of those documents right now, because it could shape decision for different industries and different sectors in the future. And I think it's important that it remains totally unbiased, first of all with regard to technology. And I think this is something which the Commission and Digit are very prone to. We promote whether open source, and we promote a lot of reusable, usable components. But most importantly also, how should this architecture look like? Ethereum was, for example, Bitcoin, Ethereum, I mean all those different blockchain, there's a certain architecture which is not necessarily suited anymore, and everyone would actually very likely agree with this with majority of use cases. For notarization, it's very good indeed. For example, we developed also some proof of concept also using Ethereum. So this is okay, but then once you really want to store assets like documents, when you want to store more, and you need obviously scalability, for example, in terms of number of people as part of your consortium to be part of your network, or how many documents can you store, how big could they be, how big your blocks can be, how fast is it, can you go up to 10,000 transactions per second, do you really need it, etc. All this has to be done on a global basis to see the majority of use cases are very key elements for selection of technology and architecture. And then you can drill down into the very, very business specific. And this, I think, can be addressed exactly to a point which was made a couple of minutes ago with APIs. So if you think of a blockchain infrastructure, an architecture, which takes into account some global capabilities, and then you have APIs on both sides, one for the data entry and one for the data consumption. And this can always be very business specific, but the core of your architecture remain the same. And I think as of today, the architecture of blockchain tends to go towards a direction where data is not only metadata anymore, it's not only hash anymore, it's also more bigger assets that can be stored also. And I think this is where hopefully the standardization and the standards of today or hopefully tomorrow will actually look like to help us all drive blockchain into a much easier manner.
Yeah, I just wanted to very briefly mention another initiative now that we spoke about GS1. And I think it was mentioned this morning, the International Association of Trusted Blockchain Applications, which is also supported by the European Commission. And I mean, that's an organization that partly will have the mission to push standardization for blockchain. So I think that should be one of the vehicles to consider in this discussion. We are building an organization to push standards in blockchain.
So, on the standards front, I mean, there's no doubt that there's plenty of existing standards at the data level and at the process flow level that exist for every industry out there, and it'd be crazy not to leverage them. I guarantee that IBM solutions all leverage the appropriate standards. Part of it is also because we need to integrate with existing legacy systems that do rely on those standards, and we have assets that actually depend on those assets that we want to keep using. But there is also the aspect, and by the way, GS1 definitely is looking at blockchain. I was invited at a conference 2 years ago, GS1 conference, to speak about blockchain. So it's definitely not something that I'm missing. And this is an example that absolutely you want to use GS1, not reinvent it, and there's no reason you would. But then there's the question of interoperability at the infrastructure level. That's a much harder issue, and this is part of what we were talking about right now. You know, when you talk about having different networks, how you're going to interoperate from one network to another, that's a much more difficult problem. And with different technologies, I agree with the sentiment that was given. You know, we have to be very careful not to standardize too early, and I've been quoted before saying this, you know. As part of my role, I work in standards as well, and as open source, and I have been asked for over 2 years already, should we do a standards? And I always say, no, thank you, we don't need this yet, because the technology is still so immature and evolving so fast. It's a bit crazy to try to standardize anything. Either you're going to produce a spec that's not going to be relevant at all, or you're going to constrain innovation in a very unhelpful way. So there is, however, a sweet spot which I think has maybe more immediate opportunity is in the application space. So for instance, in Hyperledger, there's a project called Quilt, which is an implementation of a protocol called Interledger, which allows you to do payment across different payment systems, whether they are cryptocurrencies or traditional currencies for that matter. And it basically guarantees atomicity of the transfer so that you don't get screwed with, you know, withdrawing the money on one end, not delivering it on the other. And so, I think the microphone is dying, I'm sorry. and so, but this is fairly reasonable because the problem statement is fairly narrow, and you can come up with a solution that can work for a very application-specific problem. It's much harder if you just say at the blockchain level, you know, with a big B, with like any kind of blockchain. You know, I don't think it's going to be anytime soon that we're going to see interoperability at that level.
Okay. If I can, I agree with your comments. I just wanted to start maybe by rephrasing your question, what standards exist today. If you look at what standards are used today, I think it's very disappointing. What is very common still in supply chain is EDI. And EDI is a very, by all technology from the 70s, and the EDIFACT messages are, I think, standardized in the 80s. And this is what people use today, and there are still a lot of logistic players who continue to invest in this. The major merit of that standard is that it's a standard. It's something which was accepted in the 80s as the standard, and since then nothing. The industry was not able to produce anything better. So I agree with the previous speaker that I think to standardize blockchain, to have blockchain interoperability, this is far too early, and it would slow down innovation. But I think what we need now is a replacement for EDI, and that can be something very simple, and which is, I think, an API, a web service, which allows you to interconnect an ERP, an SAP, or any other competitor of SAP with a blockchain, and independent, whether it's Hyperledger Fabric or Ethereum behind, should be technology agnostic, and even independent of the fact that it's blockchain. A very simple web service API, which is very common in other sectors, is I think required in the supply chain, just to replace EDI. And it does not have to be very complex, but there should be agreement. And who's taking initiative on this? Yeah, that's a big question mark. I hear GS1, the EDIFACT UN group is also working. These are the guys who standardized EDI messages for the supply chain in the 80s. They're working also now on APIs. I see here also at the Commission level, DG Move, they're working on digitizing documents. Hopefully this will also result in very simple standards.
Thank you. So I'd like to make a very quick point. I think because I think we're focusing on the wrong issue. And let me explain why. So just last week I was with the global sugar industry, and we formed a consortium to use blockchain to simplify trade finance in the sugar industry. None of those players is using GS1. And being GS1 compliant is not going to help you with adoption. What is going to help you with adoption is CEOs in a room deciding on a top-down vision and prompting their teams to execute on that vision. And so I think it's not the first, I don't take it badly, but I think to the earlier comment, it's not the first time that I hear the European Commission having very strong views on what the technology should be or should not be. And I think it's a very dangerous path to take. I think if the European Commission wants to influence technology, you should say, here is our standard, and if you meet that standard, we commit that will make every port and every customs authority in Europe comply with that standard. So if you create demand with a top-down will, I think you're helping the industry. But I think standardizing for the sake of standardizing, just because someone has an opinion as to what technology is better or not, is not going to put Europe in a competitive position relative to other regions in the world.
Okay. Yeah, so I also agree that there are already standards. I also agree that not all standards are born equal or are relevant in the equal way, of course. I just want to bring this my small experience because there is something which is in common among all blockchains, and is the cryptographical proof that only you can spend your money. So in Bitcoin you have unspent transaction which become spent. In Ethereum you have a state machine which is updating your balances. But at the end of the day, there is a simple technique. It's called a single-use seal, which allows for me to send a document to you. And with this document, I also write into it that you will send this document spending that specific transaction, or spending from that wallet, or anyway proving your identity on the blockchain. So I can send my first document on my blockchain, and in the declaration, I will also declare that you will spend it with your blockchain. So this is blockchain agnostic, and it is the core where we are building on this open source protocol. It's called EonPass. It's too early for standard for sure, but this is we believe it's a solid shot because it uses something that is common to every blockchain, and it doesn't go into how the data is structured because that is already been done by other parties. The way we use to store the documents is Hadoop. one of the ways to store very large amount of data. But that is not the point that we are inspecting. We want to inspect how can someone be sure that he is the only recipient of a document, that only he can pass it over to someone else. And every different player can have different blockchains. So what can we leverage that is common among our blockchains? And we are using single-use seals. So, yeah.
I think we're gonna pass
the last 2 points here, and here, and then we move on to next.
Yeah, I empathize with the sentiment that forcing standards too early will stifle innovation. So that's definitely something you have to watch out for. However, in the end, it's going to be the solutions that have the best APIs that are going to win. And once those APIs have kind of like calmed down or settled or developed, then I think we'll see people moving back to standardization. And I just heard AppSys mentioned. That's a great set of. It's a good standard for traceability in the pharma industry, but even players like SAP struggle with the sheer data volume that creates. I mean, you're talking about an exponential explosion of data by just trying to follow AppSys. So that's probably at this point would be very unrealistic to try to put that on any type of blockchain. So I think, yeah, driving innovation also means I think that we need to look at industry initiatives, and I think Hyperledger Grid is I'm looking at the gentleman over there who's on his phone right now, but I think Hyperledger Grid was just announced, which is kind of a way of getting multiple actors together who are supporting blockchain for business and trying to get standards out there for the supply chain. So I recommend everyone to check that out.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm from DigiMove because it has been mentioned. So and I also saw some keywords like standard data formats, and was mentioned what the European Commission can do to promote the uptake of the technology. So I think we can provide some answers. At DigiMove, we have set up the Digital Transport and Logistics Forum, which is an expert group that is meant to assist the Commission in identifying what are the challenges in supporting digitalization and what can be done at EU level to support it. And one of the issues that came up is indeed the problem of the data standards. There are multiple standards that are being used by different entities in different contexts, and that makes it very difficult to actually exchange the data across the different systems. And one way indeed to try and solve it is to create demand on the authority side by imposing a standard which, if it's met, or requirements rather than standard, which if they are met, then there is a guarantee that there is going to exist this exchange with that, in that format. So we actually have two legislative initiatives very recently. One has already been agreed between the co-legislators, which is on the maritime single window, the European maritime single window, which there indeed it provides both a standard for the data, how the data should be presented, but also a standard interface for the presentation of the data. And then we have another one on the information that needs to be exchanged between the businesses with the authorities to prove compliance with the legislation which applies on the conditions on the transport of goods on the territory of the EU. And there is basically data which is mostly included in the transport contracts. So there as well we're trying in that context to break down the information that is required by the legislation on data elements and to try and have across all the transport modes and all the types of goods that are being concerned by the legislation, like also dangerous goods, for example, or strip of weights, to try to come up to a multimodal reference data model that is trying to encompass on various, right now, data models that are out there for the different modes or for different types of goods. That's a work that we're trying to undertake, first in the context of this expert group, but then it would become legislation through implementing acts. So just to that's why hopefully we're going to help. But we're not talking about blockchain, but obviously there are requirements, for example, in the proposal on the electronic trade transport information, which very much concern ensuring the authenticity and integrity of data, so that there is a proof for the authorities that the data that is presented to them, when it is presented, it's actually original, it has been not tampered with, and likely blockchain, many people are pointing to as the technology that could support it. But again, we cannot mention that, we need to be technology neutral, but as long as it will comply with those requirements, probably that's the way to go.
Okay, thank you very much for this input. We learned about a lot of initiative on standard. Maybe we can go to the next point, Ludovic, will be about, I think Ambrosius probably have things to say on that, about bridging the data from the real world to the blockchain.
Yeah, sure. So really what we talked about just before was what do we have as vessels in order to bring data from point A to point B, and point A between being the real world and point B being inside the blockchain. And so we have some standards that are emerging, some organizations that are working on that. But some of the questions that are still left to answer are, okay, this information is going to be transferred in some standardized way, but how are you going to ensure that actually this data in the beginning is some data that is genuine, that can be trusted, and that is not taking the impact of some failures from devices or some malicious attacks. And so what you are going to have, very simple illustration here. You have the real world where you are going to have all your events, and you are going to channel information to the blockchain through legacy systems. Of course, this is the main gateway that is going to be used, as this is what is currently in place in what is currently being used. Human inputs that have to be considered. So this is separate from legacy system, mainly because we want to differentiate the fact that there is a question about how do you connect these legacy systems, and how do you ensure that these human inputs can be trusted. And then you have some other solutions, such as IoT, that we are going to discuss. And all this data that is produced is going to go to the blockchain, and the question is how. One first simple answer is made of oracles. This is the standardized way today to take input from the real world and put data into this chain. This oracle can be a centralized one, where you basically have an authority that is responsible for putting data in chain. And if this data is corrupted or is not cannot be trusted, it's the entity that is responsible for it. But there are many variants of this aspects. And so the questions that we want to ask today are this model based on oracles and bridges. Is that something, what is the state of the art regarding that technology? And how can we use technologies such as IoT to mitigate the impact of potential failures from the legacy systems or from malicious attacks? Any inputs on that aspect? That is very linked, of course, with anything related to standardization.
Just to come back to the very first slide you saw, there were 4 points you brought up today about what was really the objective of today. And one of them was what is really perhaps the roles of the EU, or at least with regard to this. So I'd like to come back to this and address your question if I may. To my point of view, I think the Commission has an important role to play, because agencies could help, for example, standardize by doing some work that would lead to directives, for example, that could help standardize taxonomy, that could be used through, for example, some portals, through APIs for the data input. This is already the case. Some directives are already setting the scenes with regards to compulsory information, which some organization must supply to some other organizations. That's the magic of IT, disappears. There you go. But what's important is that those taxonomies are only a guideline, and they can be extended. And actually, currently, to talk about a practical example, we know of current organizations like, for example, the Bourse, the organization like financial instruments, have used that taxonomy, and internally, all of them have started to extend it because of the practical aspect that they need to cope with on a daily basis. So this is not only to address the regulatory requirements which they need to face, but also to address their customer needs, because obviously some of them are public entities, some of them are actually private entities making profits. So this is a very good example to bear in mind, because with this particular diagram you have right now on your screen, this is perhaps the missing link that would help to drive higher quality directly, because there would be an incentivization towards using a particular template. So that could be one answer, and I think the European institution could help drive that forward. I mean, in our context, I think it's fair to say. The second one, and that would be my last point about the data input, would be how can we make sure that data quality is there? And I think using blockchain, and I'm not going to go into details, but some of you might know that, we could use the tokenization aspect of blockchain without talking about cryptocurrency or anything like this, to try to use this as an incentivization tool to help drive quality. So just giving you just a very snippet of information there. Let's imagine I need to actually input data into the blockchain, or through a portal. I don't even know if it's a blockchain behind. That's none of my business. So I need to input data there, and I'm driven by, for example, some directives, so I need to put it in a certain format. The portal would be there to help me do that, but what tells me that whatever I enter there is actually driven by quality? Okay, you can already incorporate data quality rule as part of your portal. You can, for example, an ISIN code for funds industry, for example, is 11-digit number. So you know that if you would enter 10 or 12, it would tell you, sorry, that's not right. But then maybe I can just put 11111, and it still would be acceptable. But obviously this is not necessarily something correct. And this is where the blockchain itself can be used as a tool also, and this is something maybe to open up the discussion for another workshop we could do, with regards to data quality and incentivization, and how to drive higher quality, because you can have another person who could be another validator as part of a current workflow process, for a business workflow process, who could then step in and then kind of review the transaction, if we can call it a transaction, because I put data, so as part of the blockchain we call it a transaction, and then you would review it and validate it. And that would be a very interesting tool. So this too opens up minds about the other application and other benefits that blockchain might have on some current workflow process.
With respect to the state of the art that you refer to, I think that's pretty much what we have there. That's what everybody is doing, right? Either we use sensors, we have traditional portals where we update CSV and Excel files, or we pull the data from ERP systems. But what I think is a lot more interesting beyond that is what we're seeing is that there is a whole new industry evolving of blockchain-enabled devices. And that's what I think we will see a lot more in the future, that a cryptographic chip is a standard component of a smartphone or a domestic device or whatever that is enabled to communicate with a blockchain directly. And I saw a cool example a few months ago, which was a camera. So a startup was working on a camera that had a chip in there such that the image that you take gets cryptographically signed in the moment when you take it, and then you can send it to a blockchain, for example. And I think we'll see a whole new industry of these blockchain-enabled devices that verify the data directly at its origin, and it's part of the product built in directly at the manufacturing site.
So I think that we have two people here who are very much likely to give us elements about that. Maybe Amandine, you want to start? And then you want to continue after that?
Yeah, so just, well, I second what you say. I work at Ledger, and Ledger has developed indeed a blockchain-enabled hardware device where it's still hardware, which is a little not intuitive when we talk about all this demilitarized words, but we do use a secure element, which is the chip that you have on your Visa card, and it directly. So we have done a partnership with Engie, which is the green energy manufacturer, and we put the chip in a device which is directly on the windmill. The windmill is going to give information to the chip as how much energy, green energy is produced, and the secure chip is going to be able to send the information directly on the blockchain. So it's not based on sensor, it's based on the chip that you have on your Visa card. And on top of it run our proprietary IP, which is adding an additional layer of security. And all the information is sent with the cryptographic keys system to the blockchain. So, and we are totally blockchain agnostic. It can be a blockchain, it can be the cloud, it can be anything.
Yeah, so the previous comments actually tie very nicely with what I'm about to say. Is we mentioned the oracles, which is the source of truth for the blockchain, which then becomes the source of truth for us. Therefore, we should care about, you know, what the oracles provide. And the question is, do you trust your oracle? Do you trust the source of information? And in cybersecurity, there is a saying that your system is as secure as its weakest link. The same way here, your blockchain is as decentralized as the most centralized point, in the sense that you may have the most distributed network out there, but if you only have one input of data, one oracle, for example, providing it, it's centralized, then once again we're creating, you know, the rest of the system doesn't really, you know, have any value, really. It doesn't have any benefit. I mean, okay, the benefit is nobody will be able to change the data, but blockchain was also created with the notion of censorship resistant being there, which means that there is value to all sorts of opinions, for instance. I mean, that's the element of blockchain in plurality of opinions and so on, so that there is no data that is too unimportant. If somebody posts the data and pays for the transaction, the network should record it. So from that perspective, it's interesting to make sure that the oracles are not selective into who has the right to post data on the blockchain, who doesn't, but that opens up another Pandora's box about, you know, what kind of data can be put on a digital platform, and in the EU there are a lot of laws there. And there are people who try to compromise Bitcoin blockchain by putting links to child porn on it, and then you cannot delete the link, and then you may say, oh, that's now an illegal platform. But that's an interesting element also to consider from the legal perspective. And then in terms of how do you link physical objects to the digital world, so the IoT is actually also just like the blockchain. We should ask ourselves, what is the definition of IoT? So in a broad sense, it can be any object that one way or another can interact with the internet can be considered to be IoT. So here you're not talking about only sensors that provide the data, but you're also asking yourself a question of tagging. How do you tag the object? And there, the expertise in areas such as, you know, somebody mentioned QR codes at the beginning. QR codes is basically, of course, the most basic way to tag an object, but you may have unique identifiers, you can have RFID stickers, you may have more sophisticated means. We, for example, worked on the we worked with the Swiss watchmaking industry, and they have the small kind of film with a bubble-like substance inside, which is basically, it's a physical process where you put a certain mechanical wave on the film, and then it generates tiny bubbles, microscopic level bubbles, and it becomes like a unique tag for the watch. And then you scan this tag, and it becomes a digital. There is a digital identity for that tag. So there is a big question of, you know, tagging and maintaining the tag for the objects. That's the first problem. And the second problem is making sure that the tagged object and the sensor readings about that object actually correspond to each other. That you don't have, you know, packaging where you can replace one product with the other. And then suddenly you realize, hey, that's a problem way bigger than blockchain. That's a problem of tamper-free packaging, secure chips that a couple of people mentioned, and so on. It's all parts of the puzzle. So blockchain alone for sure won't solve it. Even coupling it with IoT, you still have certain elements left purely from, even from material science. How do you design a package that, you know, maintains its integrity? So these are, you know, I guess it doesn't really help answer these questions, but it just shows how complex this situation is. So we worked on a few big use cases, and you know, you always have some holes left. So it's also important to realize, you know, where the limitations might be forever, and how do we overcome them with other technologies such as IoT. Thanks.
Well, interesting schema here. It seems to me that in order for having this system or any of these systems to work, you need a quite powerful layer of oracle, so to speak, as it's described here. And as I understand it, the oracle should be, in a sense, quite powerful database system, because the bad thing about blockchains is that the validation capabilities of the programming or the what we call blockchain solutions are not as strong as database systems as. The database system is built to validate, to perform complex logic on anything that comes in. And because of that, then I think that maybe one project could be to define a structure or a selection of a database system to allow for this filtering, this validation routines to be performed properly before data goes into the blockchain as an open source one. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, one last minute.
Maybe just one last thing on question 2, how to mitigate the impact of potential failures. I see human error. I think that is one of the main issues with blockchain, whatever topic we talk about, is I think one of the reason why blockchain is sometimes a little bit seen as something that may not work in any field is because indeed the human error can have some major consequences. For example, if you take not the supply chain but the crypto world, the blockchain itself is secure. There's a lot of solutions out there to secure the private keys to initiate the transactions, but then there's nothing that can fight against the human error. So I'm not sure how we can answer that question. I think it's a very interesting one, how to mitigate human error. I think it's education, which will help us in doing so, and I think there's a lot of fantasy also on how much blockchain can achieve, and we should put back blockchain to what it can solve. Blockchain will not solve anything. Even in the supply chain, it can facilitate, it can certify, it can do a lot of things, but there's a lot of things also that will not be solved with the blockchain, and human error, I think, is one of them.
Remove the human?
Well.
That could be a solution. Okay, so thank you very much for discussing and interacting on this topic. I would propose to move on directly to something that might unleash some passions between all of you. We are going to talk about governance. Claire, maybe you want to introduce us to the new topic?
Yes, sure. So our new topic is about governance and organization in general. So we hear all the time that a supply chain will be more efficient if it gathers a lot of actors, and the main problem is actually not to have scalability, it's to have participants to the supply chain who accept to join it. And the question is how to incentive the participant of a supply chain to all gather around one system. How should it be done? Should it be one actor who creates the impulsion and gathers a producer, transporter, supplier all around the same chain? I think Carrefour has this kind of model. Should it be consortium who gather all together and bring with them all their trading partners? Should it be maybe from the impulsion of a public entity who creates a blockchain, have administrative right on it, and just ask to all an industry to join the same blockchain? So it's more a general question about how to get adoption around the system. I think many solutions try to build a supply chain model, but they cannot find anybody to join it, and in this case it's not very useful. So how do we create incentive for making people join the blockchain supply chain?
So the way we see it, so Seal is really a customer. Yes. So the way we see it at Seal is that we specifically started the company as a consumer-centric company because they are the ultimate stakeholder in anything. We're all consumers. We're not all logistics providers or customs authorities or whatever. And so ultimately I think it's the responsibility of the brands, so you should make it attractive for the brands because they can push it through the supply chain. If you start on the other side of the supply chain, there's really yeah, it's just not really, it doesn't make sense because there are so many parties that benefit from information asymmetry that it just doesn't make any business logic. So we fully believe that the IP rights holder, the brand, should be the one to enforce it because it's ultimately also their product. And then the role of, let's say, government, in our opinion, should be that if there is technology available that can protect the consumer, then the brands would have duty of care. So, for instance, let's say there is an ill-managed product recall because they just didn't have their processes in place correctly, and people either die or get sick or are otherwise harmed, then yeah, that company should face enormous backlash from government because they have duty of care. The technology is out there, they could have done something about it, they chose to not do it, so the burden is on them.
So what I don't understand, if you say it should come from the brands, but because the other partner doesn't have benefit of this information asymmetry, so they don't have any interest to join. So how do you persuade them, or do you incentive your other partner to join the supply chain? Are you forcing them, saying that you will not trade with them if they don't want to, or do you incentive them economically?
Well, if you have a factory that's not willing to cooperate, you select another one that will comply. It's that simple. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So, I think so. Manuel from Holland. Now? Yeah. So my point is, it's a personal point, is that either you have a big player that can push its way through its own value chain, and then they don't care about sharing that throughout the industry or with their peers, and wants to digitalize their own supply chain, which is completely valid. So then they have the leverage with their partners in order to push forward that. It could be positive or negative. We could gain a stronger relationship with them. It could be penalized. There are many different ways to do it. Or then you have an initiative that is more open to the rest of the market. Again, here I wouldn't recommend to start with the whole market because it's very difficult to manage your corporate on your own. There's a lot of stakeholders and it's very complicated. So imagine having a lot of people with a strong view on many different things or not really participating. So it's very complex to try to address the whole sector with just one initiative. So in this case, what I would recommend is that you have one player that wants to do it, to be the first mover, but with the idea of extending that to the whole sector. So that first mover I would recommend to work with some few partners, very close partners, that they can define a business case, which is interesting for the whole sector, and a governance which is acceptable by the sector. Once that is working, you will have better chances of the rest of the sector willing to participate in the sector because it's already up and running. And then you can share economies of scale and so forth. So in a very pragmatic way, go simple, make it work. Maybe not perfectly, but work something that provides solutions, and then you can talk with your peers, and if the governance is right and the business case is there for everybody, then it will be much easier for them to participate.
On a larger scale, it will also mean integrate the competitors and their own supply chain. Okay.
Wait.
So I see two levels in your first question about aligning incentives with participants, because I think there's a level of the architecture, and I think Angel said it before, that the technology is as much a social construct as it is a pure technology and game theory and the alignment of incentives around each person's self-interest. So there you have one community that is aligning around an objective, and then you have the level of business applications. And there you have a different set of actors, sometimes interacting with the lower level set of actors, but who are also subjected to external interests that are not endogenous to the particular consortia or whatever. And they have obligations, and sometimes they have conflicting self-interests. I'm explaining. They might have an interest to experiment and fear of missing out and dabble in the technology and understand that this is their future, but at the same time they might have an immediate interest not to go too fast because this was cannibalizing their existing business. So for large players this will be the case sometimes, and so it's not even clear what the self-interest would be in that particular instance. So in the case of consortia specifically, I don't know if there's a way to be avoiding that, but I think some reflected process before the creation of a consortium should take place. Because a lot of these discussions on what would happen if, then that, should be set up ex ante. And what we've seen at least early on was sort of, again, promulgated about interest and hype, just rush in and then we decide the rules later. But then a lot of questions remain, and that can work in the beginning when a lot of big players see no harm in being with competitors because you mutualize costs, it's a fairly virgin ground, you don't know where it's going to lie. But once the business models start emerging and consolidating, you might not be sharing information or IP or even business models with your competitors. And their liability questions and other issues like that are not so easily resolved, or the lack of corporate governance as to who decides, and this is what Arnaud's point was before, who decides where do we go if we hit a crossroad and we're not in agreement. So these are all issues that I think are part of the regular way of doing business and should be flushed beforehand. On your last question, whether a government should take the initiative, create a supply chain that should be sort of the standard and force private sector to go in, I'm not sure that would work. Because I think that eventually the market will pick the winners and the losers, but I think public authorities have a big role to play in terms of structuring the ecosystem and providing out there a roadmap that protects the mandate and sort of covers their own duty of care, because they also have a duty of care to citizens. And therefore it kind of self-selects the ones who will actually be able to make it because it lays out the groundwork and provides clarity. But I don't think picking one winner that they create and then force everybody to go in would eventually work.
I think we will explore that later in the workshop, but indeed there is different step between having a public entity running the supply chain or being part of it. And I think Ludovic will talk about that later, but what is the place of the public body should take in a private supply chain funded by a consortium or by one actor with its trade partner is a very important question. If we had another comment here.
Yeah, just talking about like the ingredients in order to build a successful consortium and get adoption. I think in my opinion it's mainly three aspects that you need. First, you need an actor that is somehow neutral or respected in the industry and has good access to all other industry participants. And it's interesting to see that this can be different on a case-by-case basis. If you look at Mobi, an automotive consortium with like 70 to 80% of the automotive industry, that was started by Toyota, by the industry itself. If you look at the Energy Web Foundation, an energy company consortium, that was started by a technology startup and by an NGO. If you look at like Food Trust, that was started by two companies, by IBM and by Walmart. So I think depending on the context, this player that can start to pull everyone together is a different one, but it's one ingredient that I think you need. The second one is it needs to be an open system, ideally completely open source. At least the infrastructure level should be fully open source. And no party should have any advantage over another party inside that system. And I think that's, I mean, there were some news that TradeLens has been struggling a little bit to get some partners on board because the IP is not fully distributed across all the participants. And it needs to be an open system for people to adopt it and accept it. And the third ingredient, I think, is there needs to be a clear economic business case for people to join. Even if we have great players that are connected and it's an open system, if there's not enough value for the parties to join them, then they will not join. And my hypothesis, for example, for Congo, for that use case would be that for all the parties involved, there is an economic benefit of being part of that system, and that's why it was possible to pull off that consortium in that way.
Okay. Just to clarify, so when you talk about supply chain, it's basically a digitalized supply chain where the information is deployed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Blockchain-based.
Then I'll provide you the answer that we have received in the context of the Digital Transport and Logistics Forum, so focusing on transport and logistics. And what the first reasons that I say that it's not the business case, it's for many economic actors not get there to take part in such chains, is that the non-acceptance by authorities of the information that comes in digital format. So their urge towards us was to do something about that. And the initiatives that I mentioned earlier are about the acceptance of authorities of the information, which is otherwise held electronically or in a digitalized form by the economic operators are being exchanged, but they still need to use paper, and therefore sometimes it just doesn't make sense to invest in a system that then, I mean, they cannot use it also in relation to the authority. They still need to carry paper with them. So we are doing what I mentioned in transport. We also have customs that is being digitalized as well, the exchange with customs. We're also trying, making efforts to make sure that the data is required in the same way with the same formats and definitions to make sure that that we're aligned at the level. And then a second part of the answer, and that's actually going in the sense that it's been mentioned by the previous person that intervened, is that there is a need for open systems, and what inside our expert group, the DTLF, they have developed this concept of federative platforms with plug and play open infrastructure. So that's what they are trying now to develop also more at use cases, and to also come up with a governance structure. So this at least we are trying to address in the context of this expert group, which is being run by the Commission. Now I'm not sure if that answers fully, but at least we are trying to do so. So if you're interested, you can find on the Commission's transparency register of the expert groups, that's the Digital Transport and Logistics Forum, and there we also have a report where this concept of federative platforms that has been developed. And that for them is basically that if everybody can plug in with their own, so APIs, yes, it's also coming there, so if everybody can just plug into that system and then exchange the information with the others, not having to join a chain that is being run, or I mean closed systems, that's something that nobody apparently in the end wants, but rather to be able to communicate across the systems.
I think it's very interesting because in the two last comments we can really see that actually the incentive for the participants are also linked to a more global model of organization and governance. I would just like to show another slide which we were just thinking about the different way can be organized the supply chain and how to incentive the participant, and we are thinking about different model. So one big major actor will gather all his partner, or a consortium of different actors, or one run by a public entity, or a more open system where everybody could join. And it's asked this question of how to incentive people to join a supply chain, a digital supply chain, but also what should be the model of governance and organization we should go with it. Is it depending of each industry and each use case? who should own the IP, who should own the administrative right, be able to say which kind of participant can join or stop some transaction or the process. We think it's probably depend on each use case, but we would like to know if you think there is a most suitable governance structure for some use case. Or so I hear earlier that a supply chain run by a public entity would not make sense. But some people are more for like a supply chain run by a major actor or run by a consortium. So if you have any comments on it's very simplified. Of course, there is many other possibility between these four organizations, but
just agreeing with you that it's probably not good to have the public sector running a private market-based operation. And from my point of view, also based on a lot of the comments that we've gotten from the blockchain and other communities, I mean, probably the third isn't ideal, but it's also the most difficult to organize. With this International Association of Trusted Blockchain Applications, that's actually one of the ideas with the sectoral working groups, that you could achieve this openly, because it's also important not to have competition, antitrust as they call it on the other side of the Atlantic, issues that you have only a couple of players dominating it, or this optical perception that it's a couple players dominating it. So
in blockchain we're a bit idealistic sometimes.
Yeah, we're idealistic too.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah, of course.
So I mentioned already earlier that we're applying blockchain technology in ports. And I agree with you that indeed it's not public, it's not the role of the government to run such an infrastructure. But for instance, in our case, in the port of Antwerp, we had the port authorities that took an initiative to bring together all the parties around the table. Yeah? And so they started, let's say, the innovation cycle. That has been very helpful. But they don't have an active role in running it or administrating it. So I think that's a very good model, because if you leave it only to the private sector, very often everybody keeps on waiting for somebody else to take an initiative.
So I have some sort of a reflection, but maybe somebody could add any thoughts or reflections, further reflections from real life projects. On the third option, which I think I agree with Petris, is definitely the optimal one. It's inclusive, it's plural, it should cover horizontally most of the industry. I was wondering if anybody has sort of adding to this layer of, to the business case, and I fully agree with you, there has to be a business case. To the business case of an industry actor participating in this ecosystem, maybe an additional layer of incentives should be a crypto economics model, whereby by participating, for instance, as validators in the network, so working, maintaining the ledger as such, and participating in consensus, perhaps for actors in the industry or for other actors, tech companies, startups in the blockchain sector, there could be a separate incentive and source of revenue simply to participate in the validation and maintenance, the validation of decisions and the maintenance of the network, as it happens with miners, but that's old-fashioned, or validators in proof-of-stake systems. If there is a significant, if the network is big enough, there may be a case for that, or maybe it's complete rubbish and it doesn't make sense. There should be a permissioned sort of industry-controlled, more closed type of network. So, but if anybody has any reflections on that, that would be interesting to hear.
Okay.
Yeah, so I agree with you fully. We also have built our own crypto-economic model. I think I should definitely share it with you after the panel, what we have. It's very interesting, but too long to talk about it now. Yes, if you design the right cryptoeconomic model, you can create a trustless environment where there will be different stakeholders participating in the network and together assuring its integrity. However, for supply chain use case, we are designing cryptoeconomic models and we're also working on supply chain, and I can say so far we really haven't seen where we could use cryptoeconomic models to really solve specifically supply chain use cases. What we've solved them for is, yes, to make sure that the participants in the network are honest. For example, they honestly validate the data and so on. And we actually have not only rewards, we also have punishments. So people have to put a deposit in a cryptocurrency, and if they misbehave, they lose their deposit. And then the person who finds somebody cheating can claim their reward. So you can create clever systems, clever incentive models on that, which solves the problem at the base layer. It makes the network itself secure. However, when it becomes more problematic is supply chain has a lot of different standards, and we've also run different pilots in food sector, in pharmaceutical sector, and so on. And there are so many kind of specific requirements. Even alcohol supply chain and grain supply chain and medicine supply chain are absolutely different in terms of what they need and what the standards are. So. On the blockchain level, I feel that you cannot really code all those requirements at the protocol level. You would have a messy protocol. I mean, even designing something simple as Bitcoin or Ethereum, I mean, it's not simple, but at the core of it is pretty simple, right? It took people like a decade, and it still is in the infancy. Coding all these requirements and making sure that people agree on them, and who's even going to be the arbiter of that is, in my opinion, I think it's borderline impossible, because if we can agree that, okay, I have 1 Bitcoin in my wallet, so I cannot just have 0 Bitcoins in my wallet in the next block if I did make a transaction. But when you have, a myriad of different supply chains, I used to work at the Trade and Investment Division of the UN, so we dealt with WTO disputes. So there is this thing called the noodle bowl effect. Because it's like a bowl of noodles with all these regulations worldwide, which is where you have all these disputes that nobody can solve. Like the WTO cannot solve them. So blockchain will not solve that, because let it solve something simple, and all these complex regulations and standards within the supply chains are. I'm afraid that I love cryptoeconomics, but I think it cannot solve.
So. I guess my take on this would be, I'd like to be able to pick a winner from the list. But I think at the end there is no winner take all, because each model kind of serves a different objective, and they all have valid objectives behind them. Even though I was the one who said that a public entity shouldn't go out and create their own blockchain, I can see instances, because I'm actually on a sovereign fund, where state-owned enterprises would actually be obliged by legislation to run, not create, but run their own blockchain, and they would not be able to do otherwise. So I can even see a justification for that. So I think what probably is going to happen, and I think what we're seeing happen, is that all of these coexist. And so the first one will be driven mostly by efficiency from large conglomerates that can easily start deploying some proofs of concept with their own ecosystem of suppliers and clients and whatever, because it's easier to do that, and it can prove its beneficial effects fairly quickly. Then it would seem natural that they would go into their immediate sector to try to see if that can have some network effects. And this is actually something that happened when Walmart started with their own proof of concept, and then immediately after a while and after a couple of successful runs, they became an industry that's trying it out. The third one, over the equity issues, which I think are very valid, there's also the issue of addressing cross-sectoral challenges. So regulatory, liability issues, things that are common across the industry and that are not necessarily served as efficiently from the others. So I think in the end we're going to see kind of hybrid models coexisting for a while, each serving a different purpose, before we start seeing convergence on one or two.
One last point before we move on.
I would like to come back to the points raised by your colleague from the audience on the front row regarding the the economic model. The answer to your question is yes. For example, in our case, at Digit, we put some efforts to think about the economic model, and we're discussing it as part of our governance discussion as well as business analysis with, for example, some actors with which we are involved with a pilot. But we also thought of other aspects of using the blockchain with an economic model, for example, that could drive, for example, when you have to run, for example, whole IT hardware, for example, in terms of the machines, we thought of an economic model that would actually be sustainable, that would help drive quality higher at the same cost, or would actually drive the same quality at lower cost. So I won't go any further details, but if you're interested, we could discuss that, because this is a fantastic discussion. I mean, it's way beyond the scope of today with supply chain. But I think economic model could actually get a really good incentivization as part of supply chain as well, I'm pretty sure. Because those actors in supply chain are usually not public sector, they are private sector, and usually the incentivization for them is to see whether they actually can make sustainable revenue the same way as they do now, or could actually bring additional revenue. And this can actually bring an open discussion, and this is very, very interesting. So thank you very much for raising that as well.
Very interesting. Maybe a last comment before going to the next subject before.
I have a quick one, just as a follow-up to what Marina was saying. I mean, to your defense, you said earlier that those examples are kind of limited and the simplification. I think one aspect that's important that's not, appearing here is there's a difference, I think, in who gets to start the supply chain project or network and who eventually runs it, right? You make it sound like, okay, the first case is supply chain ran by one major actor. I don't know that this is viable long term, but I do see a lot of those starting it, and they can play a key role. Major players in industry sectors can play a major role in being the driving factor to get things started, with still the goal eventually to open it up so that different participants can run nodes and participate fully into the network.
This is actually what's happening.
May I? Okay, right. So maybe let's move on to the next point. So what I hear from here is that there is not a single recipe in terms of governance, and that what is actually needed is to have actors that are well motivated and able to have enough power in order to reach other actors inside their industry or inside their field. Now maybe let's talk about one step further. Once you have your governance that is set up, you will have all these entities that will be interacting with each other. Of course, you will have companies interacting with other companies, but actually what is in these companies are employees. And so you want to set up systems where you're actually managing the rights in order to access the different identities of the company in a way that is secure. And so basically the scheme that you have in front of you explains a very simple fact. So you have on one side a company that is with inside a few different employees. And so the first question that is asked here is how these identities that are linked to employees that do not necessarily link to their real identity are synchronized with enterprise directories, where these identities will be then stored. We have an identity registry here, but how is that connected to both the company and the decentralized platforms that it is interacting with and the other enterprises? And finally, how do you ensure that you have the right setup inside your company in order to manage these identities? And this is particularly difficult in a system where everything is decentralized and where you don't have a single actor managing these identities. And so first question, where are these identities stored? Do you have examples of projects that are handling this type of information and how they handle this information? maybe to take a quick example and to frame a bit the discussion on that. So what we are seeing most of the time is that you have IDs that are linked to a specific entity. So let's say, for example, we have the company one that has a decentralized identity. That is something that is also used for the discussion about self-sovereign identity and decentralized identity in the context of people, but that could be used as company registry of the different companies' identities. And so what we are seeing is that these employees inside the company will have different rights. Here you have an employee that has an admit right, but this employee will also have an ID so that later on you will be able to track who actually took the decisions and who actually pushed the button. But you also want, on the other side, to have a system where from the outside you only have one entity that you're interacting with. When you are another company, you don't want to know that you are interacting with one employee, you want to know that you are interacting with what company. So do you have examples of these type of systems being implemented in real projects, especially for supply chains? Yeah, sure.
I think it depends on the use cases. If we look at the financial industry, we have solutions that enables stakeholders to manage identity with a very high level of granularity. If we look at the supply chain in terms of logistics use case, today we don't have the same level of granularity, both with the current legacy system and the blockchain-based solutions. For the moment, logistic players or industry stakeholders doesn't have expressed the need to manage identity with a high level of granularity. So there is not this, for example, in a basic track and trace workflow, there is not this distinction between employee A and employee B in the current system. And if those company wants to use a blockchain-based solutions, they won't make this distinction in the short term. So it really depends on the use case. From a technological point of view, there are solutions that enables companies and employees managing identities with a high level of granularity using custody solutions or keyword solutions. But most of the time today, the way it's used, it's a centralized old-fashioned solution.
Okay, thank you. So not a real need for now for this type of solutions, but maybe other opinions?
Yeah, I can just tell you that I have heard about iShare. I'm not sure it's iShare. It's a system that it's a network, I understood, of contracts between the participants to the system, to which they are both agreeing on a set of rights and responsibilities when they are doing transactions among each other, as well as they're agreeing to a set of technical requirements that they are using in order to ensure that they are ensuring who introduces the data is the person who's introducing the data, or accessing it, or doing whatever actions that are required. So I understood that it has been set in place precisely to address this issue, so that you don't have to establish bilateral contracts, but rather if you become part of that network, you agree to be bound by those obligations, both technical and legal. So nobody else has heard about it?
In our solutions again for ports, we implemented exactly the same as how you described it, where we try to stay away from the individual employee level, because in supply chain, most of the transactions are between companies, not between individuals. Yeah. There are, however, some use cases where we cannot avoid it. For instance, we have use cases where we give specific rights to individual truck drivers, pick up containers, and so for that use case, the individual employee needs to be known on the blockchain. But we try to stay away from that as much as possible, only for, again, for privacy reasons. For instance, not to have any issues with GDPR. Okay, so to summarize, stay as long as possible at the company level and not at the individual level.
Okay, so there are examples of some use cases. Okay. Yeah.
Yes, maybe just to complete what has been said. Today the trend in the supply chain industry is to use central identities management system, but of course the more decentralized will be the solution in terms of identity management, the most powerful it will be in the mid-term or in the long term. So for supply chain projects, it's very important to consider it when you design the technical architecture and to anticipate the decentralization of identity management, even if you don't use it at the beginning of the project.
Okay, thank you. So I would propose to go forward to the last element. We have about 15 minutes left together, so let's move directly to the last question. And really, on this last part, there are two main questions that we want to answer about the future of supply chain. The first question will be, how do we foster innovation in the space, and how do we make sure that there are champions that are emerging here in Europe? This is something that we touched upon this morning. There are different approaches that could be done. One that was cited was the fact that government entities can impulse large projects with specific requirements in order to drive innovation. So this is the first element that we are going to answer, and for that element, the main question that you have are how are you going to drive innovation? And so one aspect that could be used is via fundings. This is the easiest one. You just take grants to projects that you think are promising and that you think could kickstart innovation in the field. The question being, what are the main criteria that you will select, that you will use to select the projects? Is it about cross-border cooperation and interoperability? Is it about the use of open standards that are absolutely technology agnostic? Is it about the integration of public bodies and how they are integrated? Is it about the impact? Of course, the impact will be part of the discussion, but how do you measure that impact, and what kind of impact are you interested in? So this is the first question about driving adoption. Here, bear in mind that the idea is to move forward into thinking about what could be potential recommendations. So this is exploratory. Don't be shy into proposing some things that are bold, and we will change them together. Yeah, sure.
I think one thing that we are trying to push for in Berlin and general also in Germany is more adoption of the technology on the political level. Maybe supply chain is not the perfect area, but I'm sure that even with supply chain there are a lot of overlaps in the public service. So if public services adopting blockchain technology for some areas of their processes, even if it's just a proof of concept, can be a very strong message and way of driving adoption also in the industry, because then we can go to the companies and say, hey, look, the government is also using that, so why don't you participate in our project?
So this is really about sending a positive message, but is that something that is enough in order to really move the entire industry and an entire continent into a broader adoption?
Maybe it's not enough, but it's a first step. I mean, to quote, like, I think the Netherlands is being very good example here. They haven't done a lot in supply chain, but in other areas the government has been super active at adopting blockchain technology. And one quote from one of the politicians was, he was like a former military pilot, and he said, like, in the military, not taking an action is also an action. So also as a government you have to be proactive and just get started with technology, even if there is no clear end game and end goal yet. Because if you just wait and you don't do anything and wait until the solution is perfect, you are not going to be part of the process shaping that. So no, it's probably not enough, but it's something.
Yeah. Okay.
As long as you left.
Yeah, if I may back this position, also in Italy, it's almost the same. The government is starting to promote blockchain, to create a legislation that is backing blockchain, and this is important because, for example, for us, most of the company that we talked with, they ask for standards, they ask for government backing of the technology, because they see it as a new thing, and if no one is granting it from the public administration, they are really don't want to use it, or they don't move after the proof of concept phase.
Okay. Blockchain, I think you all agree that blockchain is about collaboration. I think there are very few use cases of blockchain which are for a single company. It's always about collaborating at arm's length, and in this case without a strong middleman. But the point which I wanted to make is that collaboration, and I can tell this after 3 years in this place, is that collaboration is very hard. We have heard a lot of good news today, a lot of nice stories, but it's not easy. And I think the technological challenges, they get resolved. I think and scalability, all those things are relatively easy and will be resolved over time. But the major challenge is, I think, the people, and that takes time. And to create that mind shift, and we see that. I experience that every day in my professional life. So to come back to your earlier comment, the CEOs, I believe that CEOs start to understand the value of blockchain. Now it comes to a level below the CIOs, which normally should be the people who understand technology. We see that these type of people are more reluctant to experiment than the CEOs, because they also have operational responsibilities, and there is not always enough courage to experiment. That's what I see. So I think there is there are a lot of national initiatives in Rotterdam, in Antwerp, Singapore. We see it all over the place. But I think the major opportunity for the EU is to foster, I think, cross-border cooperation, and we would like to see initiatives from the European Union door that that it's easier to collaborate with similar startups as ours across the board in Hamburg, in Rotterdam. And for the moment, that's not easy. There's still a lot of local initiatives within the borders and not cross borders.
You've already heard from me, but I'll start. So, sorry. scientist on this side.
You are excused.
Sorry. No, we have, from the member state side, we have this European blockchain services infrastructure. So if you have use cases, that your government would like to push into the next wave, I mean, they're very welcome. These are, automatically cross-border for them to be considered. And then this International Blockchain Association, which you mentioned, which is having its formal founding on the 6th of March here. This will also be basically in every activity bringing together the enterprises, the private stakeholders in every area, which I didn't mention, and we're talking about funding possibilities. We'll have coming online with funding already in 2020 an artificial intelligence and blockchain equity fund to make high-risk investments in early stage companies that could become scale-ups, they could scale up. And already this year we're starting some activities to prepare a pipeline of projects for that. So I mean that's something else to watch out for. And on that, among other people, you can talk to Pierre Maro in my team if you're interested in that. And then finally, this is very new, and I think my colleagues don't even know this, and we have to talk with people about it after this meeting. But we have a possibility of a budget for a blueprint for blockchain skills in the next budget. So any inputs that any of you have on what skills are needed and what Europe could perhaps finance in that area, I mean, obviously just as inspiration, but if you have anything like that to mention to us before you leave or by email after you leave, that's very welcome. Sorry.
Okay, I promise I will not speak very much more now. In the Maeko cost project that ended in 2015 or something like that, we had a number of industrial actors, and the point here was that we should be able to calculate and present to the end consumers and the procurement officers the material footprints, the materials gone into a product, the environmental impact and everything like that. And the reason in that was Boots from UK, amongst other large corporations, and they stated that the ability to present this type of information for the end consumer was an issue of quality. Now I doubt that only presenting a supply chain solution, presenting blockchain or trust will not be enough for having the industrial actors to accept it, because it's going to be yet another system that they have to implement, to maintain, to run. You have to see to if you can create a solution that integrates trust together with other information of value. And the reason for this is that in the circular economy context, in the future, the products will be evaluated also for their total environmental footprint in the form of energy consumption and material consumption. And what we proposed during our project was, let's say that EU states that in 5 years the companies has to present their environmental footprints and all the information gaps, and we only select products that has less than 40% information gaps. The same mechanism could be done with blockchain and trust. We only choose products that shows that they have a full trustworthy supply chain. And EU represents about 15 to 20% of public procurement in Europe, which are a large amount of money. And the company from Boots said, we could use this as a quality control and use this as an argument for having the whole supply chain to adapt to our needs. Just an example.
So what I think Europe could do to help drive the European blockchain industry to make sure that there's more adoption is to work on more legal clarity. And this is not just blockchain legislation, but this is really like the nitty-gritty details. For instance, with logistics providers, currently the liability of basically sending the wrong type of product in a parcel lies with the DHLs or other logistics companies. even though that they are not responsible for putting that stuff in the package, they are still liable for it. If you want to foster, let's say, blockchain adoption and digital twin adoption in the supply chain, then you should put the liability on the sender if and only if the shipment was sent via a digital twin-based blockchain smart parcel. That is one example that would immediately drive logistics companies to basically sell smart parcels. Another one is that blockchain-based digital twins should be legally recognized and as evidence, so you can use them for taxation, for European taxation. If that would come into place, then immediately there will be a very real business case for companies to adopt it.
Another idea. So I think that what we need, or what would be helpful, would be a series of EU funded projects that bring together ecosystems and create a practical use case whereby, again, port authorities, customs, officials of various agencies can be hands-on involved in signing blockchain transactions. And so I think that what products we choose doesn't really matter. It has to be a European product. It has to be relatively standardized and relatively easy to connect to a blockchain. I'd like to propose that wine is a fairly easy use case. Besides, it's also a very fragmented industry where the local players have very, very little chance of doing anything on their own. And so that could be one idea, and there are probably others, but suggesting a few product categories where the EU can offer some funding to jumpstart a possible supply chain infrastructure could be helpful.
So blockchain means different things for different people. So actually I want just to remark maybe having a clear legal definition of what is a blockchain and what is a standard software private solution. That would be extremely helpful. In the United States they are working on it. It would be useful to have a clear definition, just because as soon as you open the boundaries for these fundings, then you will have, of course, a lot of applications. So you should be sure they just go exactly in the kind of the technology, or the kind of the definition of the technology you like. So that was my...
So I think on this topic, at least in the context of the EU Blockchain Observatory, we are trying to be not too dogmatic about it. So essentially any kind of decentralized ledger technology with blocks or without blocks, I think, is within the scope of what we are talking about. Also, we don't want to be too dogmatic so that we don't exclude innovations that may happen. To take an analogy, ride-hailing companies. Right? So ride-hailing companies have proliferated around the world, and it was about calling a car with your mobile. And so we could have defined ride-hailing as calling a car with your mobile, but since 12 months ago, scooters are the new segment, and that's where all the innovation is happening. So there's always a risk at being too restrictive.
Thank you. I will not come with any new wild idea. Rather, I would just want to confirm what you already put on the slide, because the feedback that we have, I mean, transport, first of all, is always, or very often is cross-border. It involves, and especially within Europe, it certainly involves actors in different member states. We also, the feedback that we got in our expert group is that the use of open standards is very, very important. And finally, from the perspective of the legislation that we're trying to promote, where it is about acceptance by authorities of the information coming from the private sector, definitely should try to have a use case where you involve the authorities, how the authorities can have that information, what the authorities need in terms of reassurance when that information is coming from whom, and where was it introduced, etc. Because at various stages in the supply chain, you'll have the authorities that would like to have some information about the goods, whether it's about their origin, how they were transported, or where they were delivered to whom, whether they were indeed delivered. That's very important. So.
And actually, that's a very good transition because we have an example right after of where the authorities could jump in. So taking back the example that was presented at the very beginning of the day, again, the use case really doesn't matter, it's only an example. For fishing, you have fisheries control systems, which basically are making sure that all the quotas are respected. You have the processing where, of course, you have the food safety authorities that want to have their views, and then you have all the processes that are after that where tax and customs can be involved. So these are only examples, but just to support what you're saying, and these are the type of integrations between the public enforcement bodies and this supply chain system that could happen later in the future. And I think that linking that to what was said before, I think it's important to say that, okay, we have potentially money that could be presented as that could be used as fundings, but what would be very useful would be to open these enforcement bodies in order to make sure that they are able to connect with these systems. This would mean standards for APIs, for communications, but that would mean also a strong political will in order to move these public bodies in order to accept and interact with these systems. This could be done in the future. Of course, this is only prospective, but just wanted to jump back and reinforce what you just said. What that could mean maybe in the future, and that would be the last element that we'll be discussing today. We discussed about a lot of things, and I know that some of you might be a bit exhausted, but just to draw a bit of vision for the future. So this is a modified version of what was presented during the scalability and interoperability workshop earlier in the life of the observatory when we were discussing this in a workshop in Berlin. And the key message that we were saying is that what we could see coming in the future is a set of specialized systems that are very efficient because they are built for a specific purpose. So you could have, for example, a system that is very specialized for ocean shipping, one for retail, one for payment. And these chains are all interconnected through bridges. And these interconnections are between the different chains, but also with keeping in mind the link to a more decentralized system. And the benefit of this decentralized system is to have the best of the two worlds. One side with the highly efficient systems that are most likely issued from consortiums, and on the other side a global blockchain network that could be very decentralized and that these more specific chains could connect to in order to notarize data and make sure that this decentralization is actually benefiting these systems. And what we are seeing in addition to this system is that some enforcement bodies could connect to these different chains. And again, this would mean standards, but when we take the example of the retail chain, you could have enforcement bodies that is there, and when you take on the other side a system that is more here to manage identities, you could have public administrations that are connected and that are able to push certificates on-chain that could be used later in the system. So you have both this interaction where you have public bodies that could be more integrated and be able to do their job better in order to enforce what they are supposed to enforce, but also on the other side, public administrations that are able to participate in the ecosystem and push data so that other systems could build on it and leverage them. So this is only a vision for the future. So of course this might be completely false and not what will happen in the future, but just wanted to present that to you and maybe take a few minutes to challenge it and see if you have some visions for the future. Yes.
Okay, so it's Adam from EU IPO. I was very happy to see customs authorities in your picture there, and also enforcement bodies there. Well, one thing I think that I see is missing from this picture a little bit is the citizen. Why the citizen cares about this picture. So what I'd like to say there is, in terms of enforcement, it's not just enforcement for enforcement's sake. We know that through counterfeiting, that there is a huge illegal business that we're trying to stop, and of course a lot of a lot of business is lost as a result of this illegal business as well. So I think the picture, I'd like to see that, the sort of why does the citizen care about this? It'd be nice to see that somehow brought into the picture.
Actually, this is part of what is there. Maybe this is not phrased clearly enough, but in this slide you can see that the vision is that all the system make sure that enforcement bodies and all the actors of the supply chain are interacting with each other, but bearing in mind that in the end consumers and citizens are benefiting from all this system, because first they are able to access more granular information about what they are purchasing in order to drive, for example, more responsible and ethical behaviors, but also by the fact that they are more protected against counterfeiting, or that this enables new usages. For example, when you are talking about secondary markets for elements for projects that they purchased before, they have a mean of proving that what they have in their hands is genuine. So this would need to be developed, and I think it's a very important point that we should really develop more in there.
Yes. Let's say there is a food crisis. Eggs in 3 European provinces are discovered to have an issue, and they need to either be withdrawn or the marketing of eggs from those regions needs to be stopped immediately. Can we imagine a system where the Food Safety Authority, and I guess this is mostly for Amber, but perhaps other colleagues as well, I think you're quite in the sort of vicinity of this type of project. Can we imagine a system where the Food Safety Agency of countries X and Y, where the 3 provinces lie, have very high rights, let's say, or actually we may even have a system whereby nothing is put on the market unless it is green lighted, and the green light could be presumed by a node which is managed by a public body in the network, and the moment there's an issue, they simply push a button or change the light from green to red, and then all the suppliers in that chain that are touched by, via smart contract, I guess, by the rule that has just been changed, must automatically enforce that rule. So this would allow public authorities to have an instantaneous reaction to a food scare in a way that would be integrated, hopefully on a large scale. I mean, if this can be done technically, or if it's already sort of maybe being planned, or you think it can be done, I think it would increase a lot the legitimacy of such a system and its utility, of course. And so, yeah, can we have a separate type of layer in the network with extremely high rights, of course according to the law and proportional to the law, by public authorities to deny transactions, so to speak, or to stop an entire flow of economic transactions, and of course information being added or managed through the blockchain.
So maybe quickly to maybe start answering the question, and of course this is open, so please jump in, and I think that Angel here has some proposals, but I think that actually the most important thing first is maybe not to have a way to legally enforce the different actors to do or not do anything, but mostly to access information. What is important, for example, you take the example of eggs, but we can take a very similar example that happened actually last year with milk for infants. That happened in France, where the company, and I will not cite it, decided not to share directly the information about what packages were affected by this problem. And so the government had to remind the company, hey, you have to give this information because you are obliged to do this. But this actually is a good example because you can have a system where you can balance transparency with privacy, where the enforcement bodies would be directly able to see what is happening in the market and identify where the problem happened and what is the impact of this problem directly without even asking for any permission from the companies that might be reluctant to share information because that would mean that they would have to recall a lot more packages that they would want to actually do. So this is the first layer, I think, and then of course we can imagine systems where that could enforce and legally bind the different actors in there. I'm not aware of anything that is currently being worked on in that aspect, but maybe other people have some examples.
Yeah, on my side actually, I showed to you. It's a pretty small screen, but that's the example of what you mentioned. It's basically a platform where you have, in this case, meat, and there are different stages of this. And basically you have some meat is in the freezer in a shop, some meat is in the warehouse, and so on. So you have different statuses of the meat, and then the company, in this case we've built it together with TÜV Süd, which is the largest quality assurance company in Germany. And they are mainly specialized in quality of electronics and of industrial devices, but they also have a big food division. So when they have an information that a certain batch of meat is contaminated, and here you can see, for instance, the number of the batch, right? So you can actually say that all the meat that was produced between 6 a.m. on a particular date and 12 p.m. is contaminated, and then it links those digital assets to the respective pieces of meat that are in different stages. And here on the platform to this side you can have the status sold, recalled, recalled, recalled. So you would have, we've done this as a pilot project, so it's not obviously live yet because it would probably take ages for it to be kind of the regulations to be there, but as a technology it's there. And you may even have the version where if I bought this and I have an app on my phone, I will have a push notification on my phone informing me that actually the meat you bought or you may have bought, depending on the privacy level, but that there is an information going as a push notification on consumers' phones that don't eat the meat. Because right now in the supply chains, the biggest problem is when there is a discovery of a certain disease or a contamination or whatever, the biggest challenge is nobody knows how much was actually contaminated. And very often people cannot really find where exactly is this product. So if we could have these identities, at least tracing what shop the meat arrived to with more accuracy, and a system that would force updating of the status so that the intermediaries wouldn't have an option to just hide it from the consumers and say, okay, I'm going to try and sell it and then we'll see if I'm lucky or not. Here it would be forcefully pushed and it would be executed by a smart contract, so no intermediary can stop this notification from arriving on my phone. In this case it was TÜV Süd. So if TÜV Süd published that this, obviously it's not us deciding this, and TÜV already have a governmental mandate to perform quality assurance. When they changed a status of a certain batch, it just automatically updated it in the system. So it's already there actually.
So I wanted to go back to the slide and make a couple of comments. First, I mean, this seems to imply there is one global public chain, and I really don't know what it is based that we would believe that this is going to happen. Today there are many public blockchain networks available already, and personally I don't know whether they will somehow all converge into one, global one. I think it's more likely there will be more than one, and so I think the slide would be better with different, just like you have different permission blockchains all around, you could have several public blockchains mixed in. And also, I think there's two ways to read the slide, and it's not clear to me which one you mean, but in the paper, there were talks about all the different blockchain networks relying as a backend, basically on a public blockchain, which again, puts the public blockchain as somehow the absolute truth, which maybe will be the case, but maybe not. And there is a just as much possibility that we will have a system where everything is much more flat. There are different networks interoperating at different points, but there isn't like some kind of hierarchy with some better or bigger than others. And so I think if you look at the telecom networks, for instance, there's no like absolute network that everybody relies on. There are different operators that connects different pieces of network all together. There's a mesh. And it may very well be like this. And so I think we have to be careful. I mean, as you've all said, we really don't know. We would have to have a crystal ball to know what's going to be the end game. And so I think it would be inappropriate for the group to kind of paint a picture as this is the one we believe in.
Yeah, so I think that all the points you made are very sensible. And so taking the point of having a blockchain network that is here as a central point for reference. Of course, this is there is no reason that there will be only one. There is absolutely no hierarchy between the different chains that are around that and the chain that could be used as a decentralization tool. Again, these are only tools. There might be some use cases where you don't need this additional level of decentralization in order to make sure that everything is working properly and that you are backing yourself against the risk of having some malicious actors inside your chain. So again, I think that all your points are very, you are right. And here the main aspect is to say that we don't really care about how they are connected. We are not saying that anything is better than other systems. We are just saying that they need to be connected. How they need to be connected needs to be standardized, and that public authorities will have their role to play into that connection, whether that be by direct connection into each chain or a different architecture that might emerge in the coming years. Yeah, so I think you might have the opportunity to ask the final question for the day.
Well, it's not a question, but a similar scheme is used in Cosmos, a blockchain that is trying to have this kind of impact, so unify more blockchains, public and private, with a smart consensus made by Tendermint. And so it's not that next generation, maybe more up to days that we think.
And this will be really the last
The same is true for Polkadot network. It's the same picture, and for Aeon, and for Interledger, and for all the other projects that are trying to solve interoperability and be the global blockchain that everybody uses. So I think that's not yet a field that has been laid out, and is probably the biggest question everybody is wondering about. Will there be a global blockchain or not?
If anyone wants to add their logo to the slide, just send it to us. We'll add it there.
Okay, well, I think it's time to close the day. Thank you very much to all of you for participating to this workshop. I think it was important to really take the time to deep dive into each specific question and each specific use case, so thank you very much for that. One thing that I would like you to bear in mind is that we are here mainly to help drive the adoption of the technology. And so there will be work that will be happening after this workshop. This was only the first step into the process. We will be having a workshop report first to summarize what has been said today, and then a thematic report that will bear the discussions that we had today and other discussions that are happening within the Observatory and Forum, but also recommendations and actionable plans that could be leveraged for going forward and going toward this goal of more adoption. So thank you very much again for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to see some of you maybe next month for convergence of AI, blockchain and IoT. So thank you very much.